As was mentioned, I'm a civil engineer, and I tell people sometimes I'm a recovering traffic engineer. The engineering profession, as I think most people realize, is responsible for some amazing things, that some of the greatest achievements of mankind. But there's also a laziness that's crept into the profession, habits of how things are done, almost a cookbook approach sometimes to how the profession's applied, and it really manifests itself broadly in transportation. So one of the things that I talk to people about is the importance of getting back to the idea of problem solving and making sure that we're solving real problems and addressing real concerns for people as we spend the transportation dollars that we have, which are substantial. One of the things that transportation engineers and planners don't always understand is the role that transportation has in a city. Cities were actually invented to minimize the need for transportation. If a city is well designed, you need less transportation, not more. Putting things closer together, that's what the idea of cities in the first place is all about. The practice of transportation planning, however, is focused on mobility. It's focused on speed, it's focused on distance. It's less focused on access, which is really what cities are all about. Cities are about access to land uses, they're about access to ideas, to people, to social interaction. And that often gets lost in the practice of transportation planning, particularly within cities. Transportation infrastructure is important. There's probably a reason a lot of your speakers this semester have been transportation speakers. Transportation drives a lot of policy. It drives a lot of land use. We spend a lot of money on transportation. The average household spends about 1/5 of its income on transportation in one way or another. And so I would hope that if I'm going to spend 1/5 of my income on something, it can do more than just get me from A to B, that if we're building a lot of infrastructure, that it can influence all the other things that matter in cities. And hopefully at some point that we can measure the influence that we're having. This is Ottawa, Canada, maybe 150 years ago, which was a fishing village, not much more. Nobody envisioned that it was going to be the capital of its country, much less any kind of big city. But you can see some of the fabric of the city that's still there. So you can see the streets, you can see the buildings built up to the street. All that fabric is still there today. The buildings are bigger, the activities that are happening there are different, but that foundation and fabric is still what's there. So we talk about cities having bone structures like animals do. So this is an animal that I've never seen in real life, but from its bone structure you can tell that it used its tail for balance. You can tell it's a meat eater from the jaw. And you can do the same thing with cities. So I can look at Savannah on the left and see the green spaces integrated within the small connected streets. And I could guess that that's probably a very walkable city. It's probably a city that has a high quality of life. I can look at Irvine on the right, and without doing any traffic analysis, I can see that intersection on the lower right-hand side is going to be completely congested because everybody has to go through that intersection. It doesn't take a lot of analysis to figure some of these things out. This is the plan of New York that a lot of you are probably familiar with, and what a lot of people don't understand is that when this plan was drawn, the actual occupied part of Manhattan was that bright part at the bottom. That's really the only place anybody lived. The rest was just woodlands. But they went to the trouble of platting the whole thing out. This is a still from Gangs of New York, which is set about 50 years after the plan of New York was drawn. This is what the buildings looked like. This wasn't a city of skyscrapers like you see it today. This is the kind of place they were planning for. I want to talk about a block in New York, 5th Avenue and 34th Street, which is way, way, way north of Canal Street, which is where anybody lived. This is one of the blocks that was platted. At the time the plan of New York was drawn, the tallest building in the world was the Strasbourg Cathedral, 469 feet tall. So the people drawing this plan weren't thinking about skyscrapers. They were thinking about these small buildings. They might have been dreaming of buildings like this cathedral, but really nothing else was in their imagination. But then technology started to change. So the elevator brake was invented in the 1850s, and so they could build buildings a little bit taller. The first automobile was built around the same time, so longer distances of travel were possible. Steel construction came around. The first structure that was built on that block was the Astor Mansion. It was it was a nice single-family home, but a single-family home. The next thing that was built in 1893 was the Waldorf Hotel, 161 feet tall. Subway came in 1904, and really that north-south travel became much faster and higher capacity. And so this is what's on that block now. This was completely outside the imagination of the people who planned it, but they planned that city with strong fundamentals in terms of network, in terms of land use and transportation's relationship to each other. And so over time, as technology changed, as needs changed, as people changed, the city was able to change with it. A street that's built like this also has a strong influence or determinant on its physical environment. There's really nothing else you can do in terms of land use when this corridor has been built this way. And you also leave this poor guy kind of risking his life to try to traverse it to get to the things that he needs to do. You can see this concept of bones and transformation in even more recent examples. This is West Palm Beach, Florida. In the 1980s, PBS filmed Crack America in downtown West Palm Beach, which is an affluent community, but it had a really dire downtown, as you can see here. But those bones, the streets and the few historic buildings that were there, have over time transformed into something that's much more vibrant with land uses people want to engage in, transit, automobiles, bikes, and pedestrians, really all of the elements of how transportation and land use fit together. One of the keys to getting this right is applying the right tools. So spending on transportation generally causes private spending to follow, but how you spend on transportation has a huge influence on where and what type of private spending follows it. So one of the things that you hear is that we've got to build sidewalks. Pedestrianism is important, so if we build sidewalks equal walkability, and cities will be better. The reality is that just putting a sidewalk somewhere doesn't always do a whole lot. The land use and the design matters. There are certain areas that simply have higher demand for sidewalks than other areas, so getting sidewalks in the right places is a big deal. The way we measure sidewalks is also not a great way of measuring. It's usually measured in terms of completeness. How many areas we have without sidewalks or areas with sidewalk on just one side. Getting the layers of depth about the real need for sidewalks is often not a part of looking at the system. So this is an area that's obviously not very walkable, and very likely just putting a sidewalk along this street isn't really going to do very much. There aren't that many people walking to a place like this. But as the place changes over time, if the land use code is set up correctly so that the land uses are pulled up to the street, so that the densities are changed, then the sidewalks end up making a lot more sense and becoming a higher priority than they might have been before. This is MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. The state of Maryland's office buildings, or the buildings that you see there, they were a sort of 1960s urban renewal clear out of row houses that were there before. The state of Maryland's in the process of going through a redevelopment of that. There's 2 transit lines that serve that area, but MLK is considered a huge walking barrier to the neighborhoods that surround it. MLK is about 5 lanes wide here, but you can see the physical reasons that it's considered a walking barrier. It's not really the 5 lanes that are causing it to be unwalkable. It's these physical conditions that you see here. This is Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which is 7 lanes wide and is thought of as one of the most walkable streets in the country. And again, you can look at the physical components of it and understand why, even as a wider street, it's considered walkable. So there's vertical enclosure as a pedestrian. There's a scale of a sidewalk that matches the scale of the street and the scale of the buildings. These things fit together. There are crossing opportunities every 300 feet. That's the big advantage you have as a pedestrian, is walking in a straight line somewhere. If you can't cross for 12 or 1,500 feet, that advantage is largely lost to you. And the street has activity that's driven by density. Those are the things that make that street walkable. This is a street in Atlanta. This is actually a city street and not a freeway, but the way that this street's designed tells everybody everything they need to know about how to act on that road. Pedestrians should just stay away. This is a place for cars. Nothing else really matters on this street. Transit is another thing that is often pitched as a kind of universal solution to urban woes. The promise that's held out there often is that rail transit will relieve traffic congestion. So we're going to build this rail transit line. That's going to relieve our traffic congestion. The reality is that transit's a specialized tool, particularly high-capacity transit. It's not something that's going to work everywhere. And while it does reduce congestion, it doesn't reduce congestion for the drivers on the adjacent facilities. It reduces congestion for the people who are able to opt out of the congestion that's out there in the system. So, building a transit line next to a congested freeway and expecting it to uncongest long-term, there isn't a lot of evidence that bears out that that's what's going to happen, but if the transit's built in the right place, it gives the people along that corridor the opportunity to not even deal with the congestion, and that's what the value is. And I think the point is that selling the projects under the wrong pretense doesn't really do anyone a service. These can be good projects, but the real outcomes should be discussed, and we shouldn't be measuring what's really an unrelated factor, the adjacent automobile congestion. That shouldn't really be the point of the transit project. People often have a very idealized idea of transit that hasn't been built yet. This is I guess a 9-year-old's idea that, I want to ride the train. I like to ride the train. Well, of course, why wouldn't she? When you get to be a sort of more jaded adult, sometimes change just feels like a threatening thing, and so people might, those childhood opinions might actually change. But it's important to be realistic about what transit can and can't do. So transit's good at this. It's good from getting to a lot of places to a few places. It's bad at this. It's bad at getting from a lot of places to a lot of places. Cars are good for that. So understanding where we have the conditions on the left is a real key to understanding where transit's going to be functional. It has a lot to do with urban form. So places that are set up like that New York Platte or like that Savannah Platte work really well for walking and biking transit. Places that are really spread out, they just don't work as well for transit. They're automobile based, and that's what functions well in those kinds of places. They're also, if you own a car, you're not going to choose transit if these are the conditions that you're going to be standing in to access that transit. And these are the transit conditions that probably 90 to 95% of riders in the United States deal with in order to use transit. So understanding that it's not just about the transit infrastructure, but about the access to that infrastructure for any rider with a choice is a big part of doing a good job of designing transit. Car companies have been very savvy about preying on these kind of deficiencies that we've built into the transit systems. This is a Chevy ad to selling cars by talking about how miserable people might perceive transit to be. But we ought to be talking about things that really matter to people. So cost. If you have good transit options, it can obviously be a much lower cost choice in terms of your individual pocketbook and your household finances. We should be talking about investment. Places like Denver and Charlotte are building their transit systems around their economic growth frameworks. In Charlotte, they have what's called a centers, corridors, and wedges model. They're building rail transit along their 5 corridors, and all of their economic development activity is focused on the stations and nodes on those corridors. That's the reason they're building the transit, is to draw economic development, to intensify the economic development in the places where the markets exist. And they are integrating every city department towards these goals. So it's not just transportation, but every part of building the city is integrated in this common growth framework. Bikes are often sold as something to get creative class employees to buy into your city. We need the bike facilities because that's what the people coming into creative industries want, which is true. But the reality is that putting a 5-foot attached bike lane on a fast road isn't going to attract very many people. There's growing evidence that talks about the idea that bicyclists are not monolithic. There's lots of different audiences of bicyclists, and that guy on the top left is among the smallest segments of the potential biking market that you can go get. And people need connected systems, so building a bike facility that's not connected to anything isn't much use to most people. Again, we often measure bike success by the number of facility miles, but that's not, again, a very effective measure, because if that's not part of a system or not in an area with high propensity, it's not going to be very effective. The reality is there's people also like this that are using bikes not because they want to, but because they have to. This is in Louisville, Kentucky. This corridor has about an 18% transit mode split, which is outstanding for Louisville, Kentucky. You've got people using bikes in these insane conditions because the propensity for transit, the propensity for biking and walking is all there, but the infrastructure for none of those things is present. So it's a death trap. People get killed on that. 3 people, 4 people a year get killed on that corridor, biking and walking. So I mentioned those different types of cyclists. There's those hardy spandex types. They're going to ride no matter what you give them. Capable but cautious is a big group. Interested but skeptical, and then no way, no how. The biggest of these groups are these center two. That's where the market really is. And so creating facilities that those people will use is really where the money is in building bike facilities. And that comes down to protected facilities. That's what those middle groups will use. But facilities that are buffered from traffic, the more buffering, the more likely you're going to capture those audiences. There's growing evidence around the country that's measuring these things. They're measuring places that are converting from bike lanes to buffer facilities, how much of a bump in ridership that they're getting, and it's substantial. And again, it's because you're digging deeper into bigger markets of people for this use. And when New York bought into this and implemented it citywide, it's something that really opened the eyes of a lot of people around the country, because people who hadn't seen these things before visit New York, they see them working in a place that's probably much more urban than the place they come from, and they start to see how these could be very comfortable, safe, and desirable ways to get around by bike. And with regard to system building, Portland, Oregon, which has one of the most extensive bike systems in the country, has done a good job of tracking data. So the blue lines you see are the number of bike miles in the city year by year. The orange line you see is that they do an annual count of cyclists across the 5 bridges into downtown Portland. So you can see as the system got built, more and more people started using that system. What's really amazing is that if you look at where that line goes to, there are 20,000 cyclists a day crossing into downtown Portland on those bridges. So that's 20,000 people that aren't in cars congesting those bridges and causing them to have to be rebuilt. 20,000 people who aren't buying cars from Detroit or buying oil from the Middle East that are spending their dollars in Portland. Portland has really monetized what that green dividend looks like for their economy, and it's something they see as a real tremendous value for them. They've built that whole system in Portland for the price of 1 lane of freeway mile. So the entire bike system cost them as much as 1 freeway, and it's carrying lots of people, keeping lots of money in the local economy, so a really good value for them. But that's a lot of talk about multimodal. Sometimes you just need a car. So freeways are another way that we spend lots and lots of transportation dollars. And again, the sales pitch is always that these freeways are going to relieve congestion. The reality is that freeways are typically the most congested facility type in the system. They're more congested than arterials, collectors, and local streets because they seem like the fastest way to get from A to B, so lots of people get on them and use them. They're really good at one thing, which is moving people long distances quickly. They're not good at a whole lot of other things. They're really, really bad. They're good at collecting cars. They're not very good at distributing cars. So if you're getting on and getting off quickly, freeways are not typically a good way to go. And while freeway investments, you can track, as I mentioned, you can track the spending on all kinds of transportation projects and correlate it to growth in a region. But freeways have the impact of distorting where that growth is going to happen. This is usually measured by a travel demand model. It's usually measured in the future and never looked at again. So if we're planning a freeway, we're going to predict what's going to happen in 20 years. We're going to spend the money, build the freeway, and then we're going to sort of ignore what really happened in terms of the data sets. This is really an area that if you wanted to make a name for yourself in transportation, going back and collecting real data on places where planned freeways were built and what happened, or places where they weren't built and what happened. There really isn't a lot of research on this, but there's a huge track record of experience, and getting that data and demonstrating these outcomes would really fill a gap that's out there right now. This is the way that planning happens. So we run a traffic model. It'll show us that on certain corridors there are deficiencies. And the theory is that if we add more capacity, then that 20-year forecast will be accommodated, that deficiency will be filled, and we should be okay. What this model doesn't account for is a phenomenon called induced traffic, the if you build it, they will come. If you widen a road, developers aren't stupid. They know that if you widen the road from that to that, you've made all the land along that road and all of the land at the end of that road more valuable. And so what I may have assumed going in for land use isn't really what's going to happen afterwards, because the investment itself has changed the value of the private sector investments. So you get this over and over and over cycle that you keep widening corridors, you keep inducing traffic, and then you get these kinds of corridors that really have no other purpose but to move cars. There's really no high-end economic purpose for those kinds of corridors but to facilitate longer distance travel. And what happens is that cities that were built around a river with a network based on these kinds of sound fundamentals have freeway investments that cause people, investment, value, and tax base to move into different locations. Again, this still represents economic growth for a region. It's just distorted where that growth is happening regionally. But for most cities, their image, their sort of idea of themselves is in the core of the city, and if this is emptied out to too great a degree, it can be really damaging to a city's fabric. It's also worth noting that when you're not talking about long distance travel, when you're talking about moderate distance travel, the system on the right has a much higher automobile capacity than the system on the left, because the system on the left breaks down at the intersections. Intersections of 6 lanes and 4 lane roads don't work very well, as anyone who's driven a car knows. So that system on the right can actually distribute more cars over short and moderate distances. The greatest example of this economic distortion is obviously Detroit. When politicians say that they're going to build freeways to solve congestion, I would argue that's never happened anywhere except Detroit. Everybody moved away from Detroit. There's no congestion anymore, so congestion problem's been solved. Detroit used to have a great street grid, just like most cities of its era did. But to get people to and from downtown, they disrupted that grid severely, building these freeways. And so this grid turned into that, you know, a really huge super blocks and not a lot of connectivity within the system. And I think everybody knows what's happened in central Detroit. The average home price in Detroit is $9,000. $9,000 is the average home price in Detroit. This is the Michigan Theater in the 1930s in downtown Detroit. This is the Michigan Theater now. They actually store cars, and it's a parking deck with a nice frescoed ceiling. This is Savannah again. Savannah historically developed from the river at the top of the screen, so you can see the historic part. And as they suburbanized, that blue line is Abercorn, which is an arterial street that goes north-south through Savannah. And if you look at kind of the eras of its growth, in downtown Savannah, where you've got that network, the streets are 2-lane streets. They're slow, you know, you're driving around squares, but it's supporting a lot of density, 40,000 square feet per acre of density. You go a little further south and you get to the streetcar suburbs. Still nice, but the street has turned from 2 lanes to 4 lanes as the blocks have gotten a little bigger. Then you see the parts of Savannah that they started to break the grid. People didn't want traffic cutting through their neighborhoods, so you can see they started snipping the streets, and they actually cut the green median out of the middle to add more traffic lanes. And then finally you get out to the most suburban part. Abercorn Street is 10 lanes wide at this point. This intersection at Durin Avenue is level of service F for vehicles, and it's supporting 1/4 of the built density that 2-lane Abercorn was in downtown. So this clearly hasn't been an effective model for moving cars, for developing land, for creating any kind of value or quality that drives the economy, as compared to what they were doing when a general drew that original plan, certainly not a planning professional. So a lot of this happens because we're terrible at measuring real outcomes. You know, we measure things that we purport will give us a higher standard of living, and often it gives us a lower quality of life because we haven't paid attention to the things that are actually mattering to most people. But we can change this. You know, knowing that this system has created problems. There are all kinds of historic examples of big changes, so going from a flat Earth to a round Earth, or understanding that the universe revolves around the sun, were big changes in thinking. A more recent change in thinking was seatbelts. So a few of us in the room probably remember when vehicles, not only were you not required to wear a seatbelt, a lot of vehicles didn't have seatbelts. This is a quote from 1970. When I show this and ask who this quote is from, most often people will guess GM or someone like that. It's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The agency responsible for keeping us safe said it was just impossible to mandate seatbelts in cars. So obviously that thinking changed, and it changed pretty quickly. So one of the primary ways we measure transportation is something that was developed in the 1960s based on German research. A group of engineers who decided that the most important thing to people was delay, that if I'm delayed, that is the worst thing that can happen to me. And so they correlate it to letter grades, which is something that people can generally understand. So this is level of service A to a traffic engineer. This is level of service F to a traffic engineer. An economist would give these the opposite grades. An economist would rank this level of service A and would rank this picture level of service F because they're looking and measuring different things. Historically, transportation planning has been all about looking at the capacity of the things on the left. But what people care about more so are the things on the right. I mean, people care about congestion, but they also care about land use. The addresses of their homes and churches and offices are on streets. They care about economic development. They care about having jobs. And so, they care about the environment. We need to make sure that the things that people care about are the things that we're measuring and that we're doing it effectively. That vehicle level service doesn't measure environmental impact, and that's obviously a huge driver of public policy for the past 30 years. So traffic engineers, I think, are starting to feel a little bit like this speaker, that we've been doing this thing, we've been pretty successful at getting our ideas and our systems built, but maybe we're going to have to start thinking about it differently. So instead of the idea that all transportation is about moving cars and finding more and more creative ways to move those cars, the idea that we're moving people, not cars, that we're improving the quality of the travel. That I mentioned Abercorn Street in downtown Savannah is a slow street, but nobody driving on it is angry about it. They understand the trade-off that they're making. They're moving through a quality environment with an expectation of a certain speed. This idea of getting back to what cities are all about, moving less people, fewer miles. And we have to stop talking about the idea of solving congestion. What we're doing is managing problems and managing risk. That's really all that can be done in a growing and successful city. We should just be upfront about it and measure things that help to present that. This modeling that's built around guessing at the land use, modeling it, and then building transportation to accommodate it is something that has not worked in a lot of cases. There are these things that happen immediately that feel pretty good. So if I widen a road, in the short term, the delay is reduced. The cost of time is reduced. But long term, all these kinds of things on the bottom line start to happen, which is the exact opposite of what's generally stated as the preferred outcomes of a planning process. So if we know 20 and 30 years on, we're going to get the opposite outcomes, we should probably start to talk about that with people. If we're going to get growing vehicle miles of travel, longer commute times, decreased transit ridership, that's pretty important to talk about. This is some work that we did in Atlanta. The city of Atlanta has about 10% of the region's population right now, but about 7 times more relative land area have been spent on freeways in Atlanta than have been spent in the rest of the region. But the city of Atlanta has had 0% population growth over a 50-year period, whereas the region exploded. So putting all these freeways in the city did help economic development for every place except the city itself. This is a 1958 transportation study from Atlanta. Downtown Atlanta had a 50% transit mode split at that time, and they analyzed 3 different scenarios for the plans that they had out until 1970. So transit ridership could go up a little bit, stay about the same, or go down a little bit. This is what really happened. The study itself in 1958, which was largely about building freeways, was really clear in that it said none of these freeways will work if the transit ridership doesn't stay high. So that plan in itself that proposed the freeways said that if this happened, the freeways would fail, and that is in fact what's happened. They've been congested ever since. And spending all of your money on one thing sort of traps you to one way of getting around, and it ignores a lot of the other daily needs. Getting people out of crowded conditions was a goal in the 1940s and 50s when things like cholera and emphysema were prevalent diseases, but these are diseases that are prevalent now, so getting people active would be probably a reasonable policy goal. It's probably intuitive, but there's actually data that backs up now that people who, even correcting for self-selection, people who live in walkable neighborhoods are healthier than people who live in unwalkable neighborhoods. There's actually, this was a large study that was done in Atlanta, and the average male in an unwalkable neighborhood weighed 10 pounds more than the average male in a walkable neighborhood, correcting for self-selection. So we started talking about different ways of thinking about this. So what if we just accepted a level of congestion? There'd be these kind of negative things that happen at the beginning, some increased delay and congestion, but all the things on the bottom line are exactly what planners and communities say they want to have happen in the long term. Reinvestment in local communities, less ugly sort of strip development, less vehicle miles traveled. So if those are the things that we're striving for, we should think about different ways of approaching our infrastructure investments. This was the way Savannah and New York were designed. They laid out the streets first. They let that network manage the amount of travel that could happen and influence the land use that occurred. So those systems have held up over years. There isn't a reason that we can't still use those principles going forward. We were talking about these ideas a few years ago in Minneapolis, and the state transportation engineer, his face was getting redder and redder hearing us say these things. And he said, people are going to get sick of this congestion, and we waited for the terrible thing that was going to happen and move back into the city. Of course, that's what everybody wanted to happen, so he kind of supported our point. The other thing that gets lost in all this is the money that's spent. And making sure that we're assigning the costs. Things of, the way that most cities got built were that private developers who were building houses built streets. They often built interurban rail lines as they were building further and further away, and they rolled the cost of that infrastructure into the homes. And at some point, we realized, well, that's giving us rather unplanned communities. If we as the community just took on the burden of building the infrastructure, we could plan it better. The housing prices would go down. It would be a really good investment for us. And that now just has turned into this invisible subsidy that people don't see. This is Omaha, Nebraska. We looked at a square mile in the green fields of Omaha and a square mile of infill in Omaha that could handle about the same amount of development over 20 years. If you look at just the transportation infrastructure required, from the streets that you'd have to build, from the transit service and the cost of providing that transit service, the arterials that you'd have to widen to handle traffic in the place that didn't have any connective network, you end up with about a 10-to-1 cost ratio of infrastructure in the greenfield as opposed to the infrastructure in the infill location. So that's cost that's going to be borne by the taxpayers of Omaha, which is a really kind of red state, low tax place. But they can't see that coming. No one's presenting this information to them. This is something that their kids are going to have to pay over 20 years as they pay down the cost of this infrastructure. Right now, it just looks like cheap houses. So making sure that we're understanding these long-term costs and burdens is really important. In a lot of places, this comes down to impact fees, calculating these costs and making sure that they're being carried by the beneficiaries who are the developers that are putting this infrastructure, putting this development in, profiting on it, making sure that those costs are understood and recouped. We want to understand the environmental costs. Places like San Joaquin Valley, instead of just counting cars, they're actually counting environmental impacts as well. So understanding that these costs don't just come down to infrastructure, but they come down to things that the community cares about, calculating these things, charging for these externalities, and making sure that they're being captured. Safety is valuable. The cost of unsafe streets in San Francisco over a 4-year period was $74 million in terms of medical costs, settlements, infrastructure fixes. That's $74 million that probably could have been put to better use in ways that affected the community more positively. So some of the principles that fiscal conservatives espouse, although they usually hate most of the things that I'm talking about, really actually work very well. Trusting the free market, having everyone pay their way, getting value for the dollars you spend. So not having a parking space come with every residence, unbundling those things so you're only paying for the things that you want. Making sure that you're not building peak hour parking for every single use and stacking those up into twice the amount of parking that you need. nobody complains about peak pricing for your phone plan or for movie tickets or for airline tickets. Everybody gets that you're going to pay at high demand times, but people don't seem to buy into this concept as readily in transportation that you should be paying for peak times on the transportation system. And they especially don't like doing it in the ways that are most effective. So while people will sometimes vote for high occupancy toll lanes because they can kind of buy their way into the HOV lanes, they will seldom vote for a congestion pricing scheme, which is clearly demonstrably more effective in changing people's choices about how they get around. And finally, a lot of planners are middle-aged like myself, and they tend to plan for people like themselves, but we've got to understand that the market that's coming behind us that we're planning for is different. So people who are aging into different kinds of housing choices or younger people who are making different choices, the phenomenon of people not getting licensed at earlier ages, what people consider important. This is a survey of different age groups and what they considered important, and younger age groups consider transportation to be way down the list relative to other technology components of their lives. Understanding when we invest in infrastructure, where the private investment that follows is a big part of cities doing better. This is a freeway that cuts right along the waterfront in downtown Cincinnati. You can see how inefficient that space that was used. It was a very suburban design of a freeway, and while the city felt like they still needed this freeway, they felt like they could make more economic use of their waterfront, so they really just cleaned up all those ramps into 2 streets along the frontage. What that did for them was it opened up huge amounts of waterfront land that could be put back on the tax rolls and back into development. They still had enough space in that area to build HOV lanes and an underground transit center. And so what they've seen is huge economic development on their waterfront. So for a transportation investment that got them more capacity, they also got much more valuable land and much more tax base. This is Trenton, New Jersey in the 1940s. That's a Frederick Law Olmsted Park on the waterfront. But downtown Trenton was congested, so to help people get into Trenton, this is what they did to their waterfront. Everybody got out of Trenton, hasn't come back. So they're looking at recapturing. As those bridges start to age, instead of replacing these suburban bridges, they're replacing it with network and development that's, again, taxable value, greater community value, greater connectivity to waterfronts. Chattanooga, Tennessee had a freeway that separated its waterfront. And simply as a matter of reconnecting the network that was already there, instead of having these interchanges, they envisioned in 2000 changing from this to this. And 4 years later, that's exactly what they've had. They've had over $1 billion investment in their downtown, a lot of which is keyed upon their waterfront. Cities like New York are understanding that converting space to public space rather than just automobile space is having commercial upside in terms of the rents that they're getting in adjacent properties. And then people have long understood that in places that have good markets, transit is something that can focus those markets. There's probably no better example than the red line here in Hollywood, where the rents have quadrupled around the transit stations in Hollywood as a result of that really focused and well thought out investment. And so my last point is that these ideas are unusual for people. Talking about doing things other than helping their car move faster is not what they've been hearing for 40 years. So you've got to be really clear about what they're getting. So if you're gonna charge people more for parking, spelling out what they get for the money that they pay for the extra parking is really important. It doesn't feel good to pay more for something unless you understand what you're buying with that. If you're slowing cars down, explaining to people that we're slowing them down to help create safety is important, or that we're doing this to create economic development. So getting these ideas out there, communicating them effectively, losing a lot of the jargon and communicating in visual ways, in ways that are meaningful for people is pretty important. But I think if I could leave you with one thing, it's the idea that we have to be much more intentional about how we're spending this 1/5 of our income on transportation. Just leaving it to chance and hoping for the best hasn't worked out for a lot of communities around the country. And I think one of the keys to that is really getting data, understanding what matters about that data, and applying it effectively. And so hopefully that's a decent transition to some of the points that Sandip could make for you. So.
I thought this was a very, refreshing talk. I mean, for an academic audience, and I wanted to focus on many of the same things that Paul focused on. And I think the key is to understand that we need to solve real problems with the public dollars, right? And although the title of this talk is Managing and Not Solving, but I would probably argue a little later that probably they're the same thing. I mean, when we are talking about urban transportation, managing better or managing well is the solution that we want, and that's probably the best that we can get. I think there were some very interesting and important issues that were raised. Is the fact that we need to put infrastructure in the right places. So building infrastructure is not enough, as Paul mentioned. It's we need to do it right, and we need a lot of evidence. So we need a lot of studies, and all these interventions need to be backed by empirical findings, right? So that's important for us students. As part of Ph.D. training is being critical about everything you see. So I kind of liked Paul's argument that rail cannot really solve congestion, and I've seen this through some of our own studies here at USC. That we looked at my research group with Professor Jen Giuliano. We looked at the Expo line and whether or not it had been able to solve or reduce traffic congestion along the corridor that it serves, and we found that we need to be careful when we talk about these benefits of rail. There are benefits, but we need to measure the right things, and that was again highlighted by Paul. The other thing is interconnectedness of systems. Building transit is not enough if systems are not well integrated. That's very important. And also, sometimes you just need a car. I really like that slide. And we all know that we have been investing a great deal on transit. We have been investing a great deal on building TODs. And we haven't probably done enough, but we have done a lot. But transit ridership relative to the amount of service supplied has not really increased. So transit systems are, we have data to show that they're getting unproductive, right? So that's something that we need to think about, building transit in the right places. Again, there are many studies which are looking at really context-specific studies which are looking at specific rail corridors and the context under which they're successful and why they're not. So that's, again, very important. But I want to go one step back, which is we talk about congestion and chaos in urban areas, right? But let's face it, I mean, congestion is not something that has been thrust upon us. We are kind of drawn to congestion. The most productive cities are the most congested, and those are the most desirable cities, right? We love to live in congested cities, and congestion kind of attracts us to those places. We would probably not like to live in uncongested places, right? And that's because a lot of people try to live close to each other because there are benefits to it, and they try to move around at the same time, and therefore we have all these peak period congestions that are kind of annoying, frustrating, but we have a high tolerance level. And through my own research looking at people with choice, those who have cars but still use public transit, right? I mean, people who own cars, a tiny, like less than 1% of them use public transit and the rest don't. And those who don't use public transit, they travel under severe congested conditions, under high levels of unpredictable conditions, and they kind of stick with it. And so when I look at all those people, waiting in their car, and, in congested situations, I see all those people that they have chosen the best alternative that was available to them. Let's face it. And the idea has always been to increase the costs of driving and provide good alternatives. But unfortunately, through a lot of studies, what we now know is that if we don't increase the costs of driving to to enormously high levels. And if we don't make alternatives like transit or like incentives for carpooling and so on and so forth, extremely attractive, it's very difficult to bring people out of cars. So probably the best that we can do is manage systems better, right? And so, and I also, what Paul mentioned is people are going to get sick and tired of congestion. Probably they're not. People are going to deal with congestion, and we have to sort of therefore provide, we have to manage systems better, multimodal systems better, not only transit but also our auto system, so that people can make choices more efficiently. And also I want to touch upon Paul's point of what we call triple convergence, right? So if you increase capacity, it's going to be filled up with more people. So if you build more roads, or even if you add public transit, a light rail line, it's not going to relieve congestion, because in places like Los Angeles, where latent demand is very high, people who used to travel in off-peaks would get on and travel in the peaks. People taking other routes are going to travel along the freeway. People who took other modes are going to take that road. And therefore, within a very short time, you would find that the same road is as congested as it was. So in these kind of conditions where there is high latent travel demand, it's even more challenging to mitigate congestion and manage systems more efficiently. And therefore, we need to be careful when we think about, with increasing flex times and increasing telecommuting opportunities, increasing opportunities to work from home and light rail. We need to be careful when we overstate the congestion benefits that they're going to bring about. So, that's something to think about. So, so what do we do? As academics, what can we do? I think the faster we realize that these are not easy, there are no easy solutions. These are difficult problems, wicked problems, some people say. So the faster we realize that these are difficult problems, the closer we can get towards finding a solution, or a management solution, let's say. So what I think is managing the system is key, and so we should probably focus on increasing the efficiency and productivity of systems, multimodal systems. It's complex, but we need to take that kind of an integrated approach, right? A couple of last things. One is, so I thought about it, and I think that we need to focus on the 3 I's, which is inquiry, innovation, and information. And I'll touch briefly upon each one of them. One is inquiry. As students, as researchers, what we can do is we can learn from successful projects, not so successful projects. Part of the Expo Line study under Professor Marlon Burnett is looking at the Expo Line and the kinds of, an experimental study of what changes it has brought about within close proximity to residents who live close to Expo Station. So we need to learn from those projects, and before going forward with proposing solutions, we should first understand how people and networks work and interact with each other. So that's important. And this would probably lead us towards more innovative solutions, and we saw some innovative solutions, very context-specific solutions, which made a huge difference to communities. So it's breaking away from that traditional, supply side management or traditional demand management tools that are more politically popular to more innovative solutions that, by involving communities and by by learning more about systems. So that's important. And the last point I think is important is information and data, and I think that that's going to be a big game changer. And when we talk about big data, big data, let's say large data. Everybody says big data nowadays, right? Essentially what we're talking about is data that's high in, and this is from Google, random Google, and I found it quite interesting that it's high velocity, high volume, and high variety. And increasingly, with increasing instrumentation across the urban transportation system, more and more real-time data from multiple systems, from loop detectors, from transit vehicles that are fitted with GPS, and so on. And all these data are increasingly getting available for researchers and for transit operators for both real-time management and using historic data to learn more about the systems. So that's going to be, I think, a big game changer, and also social networks and people-to-people connecting, like shared rides and so on. And finally, just to give you some examples, you can search for those projects. Like the US DOT has this ICM projects, which are integrated corridor management projects, which is sort of demonstration projects where cities use a variety of these big real-time data sets for implementing a wide variety of sort of interventions. For example, ramp metering, signal coordination, dynamic road pricing, traveler information, and so on. So the thing is, I think moving forward, this big data sets and are going to improve both decision making and also make travel choices enhance this decision making in terms of making more efficient travel choices, which again is going to feed back into enhancing or making management of systems more efficient. And cities are using probe data like mobile phone tracking data. They're using GPS traces for, again, like Pasadena, I know, is collecting data for for developing their OD matrices for their network. For their traffic models, and also like at USC, the IMSC at Computer Science, they are developing cool apps using all this data fusion, various kinds of data to develop more efficient routing apps, which they claim are even better than Google, by using archived data from multiple systems across multiple agencies. But again, we have to be careful because big data has bigger problems. There is a lot of multi-agency and multi-jurisdictional coordination that's required, and that's again issues that needs to be solved. And again, there has to be a huge capability to manage, store, and analyze these big data sets. So as planners, probably we need to learn the language of computer scientists, of database management people, so that we can use these data sets more efficiently for solving the urban transportation problems, right? And so I also think that the private sector has a huge role. For example, we were just talking about INRIX. There are private players who kind of collect and fuse and integrate and process data from various different sources and make them usable for, again, public agencies to manage their systems better. So I think, again, data is going to be the big thing. And so the better management of systems in a very context-specific manner is the road ahead, I think, and Paul can fill in on that.
Well, I really enjoyed your presentation. That one topic regarding transportation public policy leads to private spending. That's kind of like why I'm here, more on the private sector side. And investments. I know I've reviewed your brochure, and I know you're opening an office here. And I saw that you were involved with some of the urban, which is the LA area, as well as the suburban. I saw you got some work going on in the, I think, in the Victorville area, and as well as the Palmdale. Can you kind of give us some insight, at least for me, from the private side, on what, I guess, trends you're seeing or benefits or opportunities you might see in regards to what you're working on right now?
Sure. So one of the I think for the past 10 years, most people are familiar with the kind of central city urbanization and infill that lots of cities around the country have been seeing. And a lot of it is, it does come from some people getting sick of congestion and long drives. It's not everybody, but I mean, when you get to places where you have a 1-hour commute each direction, there's a certain number of people who are just like, I can't do that anymore. I'm going to buy something different where I, at least if I'm still driving, I'm driving a shorter distance. The second wave of that we're seeing, and LA region's one of the places where this is the most prevalent, is first ring suburbs. And so, I remember about 15 years ago, there were news stories about rioting in the Paris suburbs. And I remember all of my friends like laughing, like, who riots in the suburbs? But it's because Paris's suburbs are like US's first ring suburbs, right? They're no longer these kind of affluent central city flight people who bought the homes originally in the 70s and 80s. It's largely higher density, often immigrant populations, often transit-dependent populations moving into sort of garden-style apartments from 70s and 80s kinds of eras. So those communities that were built for one kind of thing and now have a completely different set of drivers are really, that's where the action is right now. It's first ring suburbs. And so, the LAs and Atlantas and Charlottes and Denvers are places that are seeing that, all of those communities that have now, they've denied and denied and denied that these changes are going on, and now it's just smacked them in the face that this is who we are now, and we have to start planning around it and building infrastructure that is relevant to who we are now and who we're going to be in the future.
So in a place like the LA metro area where we have so many different planning agencies doing work and some of the work is overlapping and some of it is adjacent, how can we try to increase crosstalk and increase goal sharing and things like that? Because it seems like sometimes we're also set on like what is my agency's goal at the moment, and we're not doing enough to kind of talk about the regional goals.
There's, it's one of the big problems in planning, and this is probably not news to anybody. It's not just that town A and town B that are next to each other share common interests and don't talk to each other. It's the siloing that goes on between modes and between even departments within a city. It's astounding. The water and sewer department, whose facilities run underneath the streets, never talk to the people planning the streets until they need to tear a street up. Or you'd be amazed at how many city councils, if you go to talk to them about improvements to the transit system, will be like, well, it's, Metro runs transit. Why? It's not my responsibility. But it's your citizens that use that system. It's I don't know any other way to deal with it other than to point it out to people that we're planning for the citizens of your community. These are the things that are important to them. Who's responsible for what is completely unimportant to them. That's our jobs as professionals to sort of make those barriers invisible and actually communicate with people about what they're trying to get to happen and what thing could cause that to happen. That's if you get the answer to that, let me know, because that's like what this job is basically, is figuring that out.
So you're new to the Los Angeles area, or relatively new. There's a lot of big transportation projects going on here, transit, there's widening. What do you kind of see the biggest challenges for us as a region? What do you think we're doing right so far?
I think, to me, coming from the outside, the things that are most clear and obvious that this region's doing right are what Mayor Villagrosa did with accelerating the transit program is transformational, and what Mayor Garcetti's doing with the LA River. I'm not sure people realize it now, but the degree of economic impact that project is going to have is going to be breathtaking. So those are projects on a scale that really nobody else in the country is tackling, and are in a place that, when you look at the LA River and what it is now, and you look at transit and what it was here 15 years ago, to tackle those two things is bold. The challenge is, as Sandip talked about, is that neither of those are solutions for everyone. And so I think I think the region has to be realistic about what's going to be accomplished with those investments. Transit investments of the kind that this region's making are highly effective if you constrain the area you're looking at to the corridors that are affected. But if you look at transit mode share for this whole region, it's nothing. So I think again, I agree. It's one of the things we need to acknowledge that when you're building certain of these systems, making certain of these investments, the people who benefit are the people who live or will live, within an influenceable shed of those things, and we just shouldn't pretend it's otherwise. But I mean, I think it's amazing to me. I've talked to people, as I've started talking to people at the city, and at SCAG, who are mired in this. Sort of all they see is kind of the obstacles and the silos and I can't believe so and so did this and that. But from the outside looking in, I mean, this is where it's at. This region is doing just transformational and amazing things relative to what the rest of the country is doing.
I just wanted to ask a question regarding the statement that, I'm sorry, I'm not in the transportation concentration, so you guys may all know about this and I understand the skepticism towards not just assuming that people will use the transit if you put the infrastructure in. But I'm just kind of wondering what are some of the skepticisms about that? I'm just thinking in my head, more so on the East Coast. I mean, nobody in their right mind thinks to drive a car to New York City, and they have the opportunity. The infrastructure is there, and so maybe it just needs time to evolve. I also know, and then I thought, well, maybe on the West Coast we love our cars, and so. But when I think about it, I mean, I live and I work in San Diego, and everybody that you possibly know that can take the coaster, they drive 2 miles to the coaster station and they take the coaster because they love to take public transit. And so I'm just kind of wondering, where is some of that skepticism coming from, and what are some possibilities? I know, I personally would love to take transit, but coming here would take me an hour and a half, going home would take 7 hours. So it's just kind of it's not an option, really. So I'm just wondering.
I have a couple of thoughts. I'm sure you do as well. So one thing is that, let's focus on very high capacity transit, so like rail and bus rapid transit and things like that. One of the things that when you actually go look at the data, if a well-designed rail transit project, for example, the transit agency has probably long ago already figured out that corridor is going to be really effective for bus ridership, and has probably done all that they know how to do to get effective bus service in that area. So when you put a rail project in, a lot of what happens is the rail project ridership is cannibalizing bus ridership that was already there. And that's not without value. Those buses that aren't being used anymore can then be deployed elsewhere. The people who are using the rail transit are getting a faster ride, which is certainly valuable to them. And you do in fact pick up, if it's well designed, you picked up some new riders as a result. But understanding that in places where only some of that ridership is going to be new ridership. People who are dependent on transit will take that hour-and-a-half transit trip because they have no other choice. And so I think it's a very solid public policy argument to say that transforming that into a 30-minute transit trip is extremely valuable and worthwhile if you don't attract any new riders. I'm not a politician, and I probably couldn't be, saying some of the things. And I don't know that you'd get a lot of votes saying that, but I think from a sound public policy perspective, there's just nothing wrong with saying that improving transit ridership for the people who are currently taking transit is okay and is worth doing. And then finally, the red line example I gave, we should just be saying that project is about economic development. The focused amount of economic development that's happened in Hollywood as a result of that sort of transit investment has been extremely valuable to the bottom line of the city, to the character of the community around it. And that is something that very high capacity transit does tremendously better than just really good bus service.
On average, in the Los Angeles region, door-to-door transit travel time is about 4 to 5 times auto travel time. Now that's a problem. Now that's not, that cannot be generalized across regions. So if you're talking about other cities, this can be very different. But the way Los Angeles has grown, and and bus systems or rail systems has to be fitted into the road network or whatever, right? So as it stands now, every person needs to make at least a transfer. So the average number of transfers door to door by transit is about 1.1, let's say 1. So you need a transfer. It takes you 4 times the time to travel by car. And then a bus typically stops like 5 times every mile on average. So these are just averages, but don't go by averages. There are good projects, right? So if you take for example, the Expo line, the connectivity that it provides from Culver City to USC is comparable, or in some cases better than the auto mode during peak periods. And therefore, you would see a lot of USC students who have chosen to live in Culver City, who travel every day and they take the Expo line. And that's because parking is expensive. If you park outside of campus, search time is too high. And then the 10 during peak periods is highly unreliable. Sometimes it's very congested, sometimes it's not. And transit travel time is comparable. So in those kinds of contexts, transit can actually compete with the auto mode, and it is, right? So key is identifying what those contexts are and what group are you catering to, right? So, if we just have this idea that transit is going to solve problems, if we build rail somewhere out there, people are going to use it, probably not. So there has to be a lot of other factors that needs to work towards making transit, compete with the auto. And in most cases it cannot, and therefore transit hasn't really worked as well as it should have. But that's what I was talking about. I mean, now we are learning from these good projects, and it's possible that now that we have this mega transit expansion program, probably we'll be doing the right things, right? So,
and there will be people that will choose their location for working or living based on the availability of good transit. And I think one of the things for cities to be smart about is effectively estimating. I mean, because that is the focusing of markets that I mentioned. It's how many of those people who will make that choice can we effectively capture, and how does that change the economics of place? There's starting to be better data on that, but it's still sketchy. There's still debate about causality of some of those things. That's another one of those areas where getting better data about the relationship between transit infrastructure investment and economic outcomes is going to be really valuable. I mean, the best data is coming out of markets like Washington, D.C., where you could argue things were going to develop anyway. It's just an attractive market. But, finding places that there's a more diametric effect to the transit investment and having data around it would be really effective in putting some of these arguments in a better focus.